Welcome, everyone. We are glad that you've joined us for the Friday of our summer seminar, and we are thrilled to be joined again by Professor Lauren Heller, who is presenting two lectures this afternoon in a lecture titled The Wealth and Poverty of Nations in two parts. Professor Heller.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I wish I could see you, but it's good to see you again in one sense of the word or another. So today I'm going to talk about all kinds of issues of wealth and poverty. But first, let me start by setting some things up. So when I talk about wealth, what do I mean in terms of global wealth? Well, one thing we should talk about is how incredibly rich in the grand sense of history that we are. So here's a pretty informal, graph of real GDP per capita for planet Earth. Many of you guys have probably seen this graph. It's known colloquially as the hockey stick graph among economists. But what do we notice, right? And it goes on before this, right? So for the vast, vast expanse of human history, we are pretty miserably poor, right? So this is what Malthus means when he means subsistence, right? Hobbes might have had a point here when he talked about life being nasty, brutish, and short, right? So if this is the year Jesus and this is the year today, right? Oh my gosh, we're so poor, we're so poor, we're so poor, life sucks, life sucks, life sucks. Oh my gosh, we're so poor, oh my God, we're really rich, right? All of a sudden, we become pretty wealthy insanely quickly, right? In the grand scheme of things, right? And wealth per person skyrockets, all kinds of other things skyrocket in the very recent history, right? But it's not just about the money. You might be saying, well, Heller, you economists, right? It's all about the money with you, right? And so to an economist, it's kind of about the money, but it's a lot more about the stuff you can buy with money. And one of the things you can buy with money are things like life expectancy, some measures of life satisfaction, and so on, right? So just to give you guys, this is the even more recent history than this, right? So we're talking from about here on. Look what happened to life expectancy, at least in the US, right? In 1930, our life expectancy was right about 59.7. And then the most recent data we have on life expectancy overall shows that we're at about 78.9 years, right? So that's almost 20 years, right, in additional life that we've accumulated, right, in less than 100 years, like a pretty big deal, right? In 1930, right, this is at the start of the Great Depression, right? So we're even starting from a pretty low point, right? So huge changes over that time. And of course, if we're going to talk about life expectancy, it's two sides of the same coin, is life expectancy and infant mortality, right? Because if you have a lot of infants dying, right, that's a lot of low numbers in your average for life expectancy. So of course we see over similar periods, although this is a more abbreviated period, right, up here than down here, but we see life expectancy just plummet. I mean, sorry, not life expectancy, excuse me, infant mortality rates, the thing we want to plummet, right, between 1950 and say the 1990s. Right? And we can talk about that in more depth if you guys would like. And so, but what does that mean, right? So this is the world, right? And we've had discussions I know other lecturers have had discussions about how do we feel about averages, and are averages really telling us what we want them to? But if we bust that out, right, and thinking about decomposing it, like, so if I zero in on this graph from 1820 onward and split it out by world region, right, I see a little bit different of a story, right? So from 1820 to the early 2000s, right, we still see a good part of that hockey stick for places like Western offshoots. This is data from Angus Madison, who was an economic historian that lots of economists like to talk about. And that data still, we have the hockey stick story, right? For Western Europe, a big part of it, we've got the hockey stick story. In Japan, same story, right? But then when you talk about the rest of Asia, right? Staying poorer for a significant number of time. And then it isn't until right about, we're going to say around 1976, there's an important, that's an important year, right? Essentially, it's the year Mao left, yay, right? We see Asia start to take off, right? And other places, but this isn't evenly distributed, right? And so we see, although the situation has gotten better, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa since this data, we still see a pretty huge difference, right, between wealth and poverty in our world overall. And so this is something that we might want to think about globally, right? And talking about what explains this, right? This is the whole action of economic development, right? Is why are some countries rich and others poor? What explains this divergence, right? That's the process of economic development that most folks really at the end of the day care about. But there's other kinds of inequality you guys might be thinking about, particularly that has come in recent months. So along with lots of other protests we've seen, like the Black Lives Matter protests and other things going around in our world, COVID protests, all of the rest, we've seen a lot more discomfort, particularly in our country, with inequality. So this is an article from just last week about pitchfork wielding, they were plastic pitchforks, but still pitchfork wielding protesters are descending on the Hamptons, right? And they're visiting folks like Michael Bloomberg and folks like that. And I think it's interesting that they visited Bloomberg. We might want to revisit it, right? Want to revisit that when we talk about inequality. We see other places, like a protesters in La Jolla, right? On the other side of the country, targeting wealthy folks, right? La Jolla is very sort of well known as, in addition to the Hamptons, is a particularly wealthy area, right, of the country. And so there's a lot of discomfort, I think, in our society about inequality, right? And about, is this the price we pay for markets, right? And for market liberalism more generally, or what some might call neoliberalism, but I don't love that word. So this brings me to our general plan for today across 2 lectures. So first, we're going to look at wealth inequalities within wealthy countries like the United States, right? So we're going to look at this story first. And we're going to take these arguments seriously. I think it's important to, but we're also, at least I'm going to suggest that with these arguments about inequality in the US might actually be arguments about other things, right? 2 other things specifically. It might be arguments about crony capitalism and structural barriers to equality, and they might be arguments about poverty. And so we're going to address the crony capitalism stuff. Spoiler alert, I largely agree with a lot of the inequality protesters on that level. And then we're going to turn our focus to cross-country inequality and poverty issues, because I think you'll see, as I show you guys a little bit of data, this might be the bigger problem for us to tackle if we really care about poverty. So then, after we do that, and after you have the opportunity to pepper me with questions from your breakout groups, in today's second lecture, we'll take a look at what hasn't worked in poor countries in the past, and then what might and what does seem to be working. Some previews, you'll hear a little bit of a shout out to Fabio's earlier lecture here. If we really cared about poverty, we'd open the borders rather than engaging in voluntourism and the like. You'll also hear some ideas about how entrepreneurship and private solutions can better contribute to long-run growth. And also, I'm going to make the argument that neocolonialism, at least in the form of either misappropriate aid or nation building, or try to going and establish governance other places, that's not it. Okay, and so then hopefully I leave you at the end of the day with some ideas that you might want to consider about what we actually can do from a classical liberal perspective. Okay, so first let's start talking about inequality, right? Particularly inequality as it relates originally to places like the United States, Western Europe. Because one argument we always hear, right, about the United States is that we have some of the worst sort of inequality measures in the world, that the rich are pretty rich in the United States compared to the poor. And often this is leveled as a criticism of the sort of slightly potentially more liberal atmosphere of the United States, or at least the lack of, say, a large social welfare state and things like that. But I want to push back on this a little bit. And in doing so, I hope I also build on Professor Labar's lectures earlier in terms of thinking about inequality and egalitarianism. So I'm doing this much more from an economist perspective than a philosopher perspective. So please excuse my, lack of wonderful grace that we saw in Mark's lecture. So I think this cartoon illustrates something like what we might mean, or what we might be thinking of in traditional conceptions of inequality. So it's the idea, right, what's going on in this graph, that the rich is getting richer, right? He's walking away with all of the money, right, the rich guy. And what's he about to do, right? He's about to take his foot off of the, I guess, plank that everybody else is hanging on. So since this guy is walking away with all of the money, these guys are about to fall off the cliff, right? So this sort of notion that as wealth is created, it's almost sort of a zero-sum game argument, right? That because the rich are getting richer, they're in some ways leaving the poor behind. And we see this in our traditional textbook definitions in economic development and other places. So this is a typical, I could have pulled it out of almost any economic development textbook that you might want to think about. But this is a typical textbook definition of inequality from a pretty famous development economics textbook. Lots of people use Todaro and Smith when they teach development economics. It defines inequality as the disproportionate distribution of total national income across households. What I think is really interesting about this definition is it's written in such a way that does a few things. First, it implies a pretty static nature of inequality, right? That this is how income's distributed. There's no talk about movement or income mobility, but also it's talking about income distributed in a very sort of passive way, right? It's sort of the idea that Santa comes, right, and bestows income, right, on different household heads and then leaves. We have no idea how it came about, right? Which I find that really problematic for a variety of reasons, right? One reason is that Santa doesn't do that. First of all, guys, most of you all are grad students, so I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Santa isn't real, I'm sorry, right? But second of all, right, just as Santa isn't real, this idea of how national income works also isn't real, right? Typically income is earned, right, by various people for various ways. And how we earn that might matter, right? And so when people are typically concerned about inequality, I actually think it's kind of disingenuous to talk about like, this is the distribution that society gives us. It leaves very little open for individual choices and individual behaviors. I also think that when we talk about inequality, we could ask ourselves, is income inequality the only type of inequality that matters? Right? If it's the only type of inequality that matters, why? Right? And so what do we really mean when we're talking about inequality? Right? For example, I'm just going to let you guys know about a particular inequality that exists in the world. So it turns out that even though we are both blondes, I do not look like Carrie Underwood, right? And I also cannot sing like her. It is a tragic, tragic inequality in the world. However, and I know I'm being very silly, right? And very flippant. But the reason I'm being flippant is I don't think this is what we worry about when we worry about inequality. Sure, maybe, high school kids worry about this kind of inequality, or middle school kids, right? When they're worrying about, are they the most popular girl in school? But when we talk about inequality in terms of development and wealth and poverty, this is not the thing we care about, right? And so it leads me to the idea that if it were simply, income were simply distributed as a distribution, right, where we're putting presents on people, well, looks are something that's kind of related to a distribution, right, that we put on people. Maybe singing ability, of course, vocal talent can be developed, right? But there is some inherent sort of genetics about it, right? But the reason we might care about income inequality is we actually don't view it as a gift, right? This income inequality, when we talk about it, we don't mean something that's bestowed on us, right? We mean something very different, right? So we might mean things talking about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. When we talk about income inequality anyway, we might be talking about that because we're thinking about, do people have the same opportunities, right, to succeed, right? Or is it just how do they end up? We might be thinking about structural barriers that might exist in our society to inequality that don't exist when we talk about looks or something else. We might also be thinking about really be thinking about the notion of income mobility, right? So, and you can ask yourself this question, right? Which is more important, right? The position of someone in a given distribution at a particular point in time. And we also need to, by the way, be very careful when we talk about that data, because we need to talk about things like inequality over the life course, right? Where you are at 20 years old in terms of an income distribution is very different than where you might be at 60 years old. And that might matter a whole lot. Are we talking about the ability to increase living standards over time, right? The ability to climb an economic ladder in one way or another. And often that gets lost in the ideas of inequality. Also, right, many sort of common measures of inequality focus on outcomes, right? The second one, rather than income mobility in a very static sense, right? This was, I realize as I made this lecture that I'm very old, that many of you may not even remember the 1% protests. Well, you probably do, but you were probably young, and I'm just sad about that. Right, but when the 1% protests were really going on, you know, the Occupy Wall Street movement and all of that, there was this notion of the 1%, right? That 1% of incomes, right, controlled sort of the entire U.S. financial system, right? But if you think about it, that particular point in time question is very different, right? It's easier to talk about. Sure, it's easier to talk about that, right? It's very easy, much easier to measure. We can, well, easier. I'm going to talk about that in a second. It's a lot easier to measure where people are at a given point in time than following folks over time and looking at movement. It's nearly impossible, right, to follow folks over time and look at movement well in developing countries. But it's also pretty actually hard to look at that data in the US, right? So it's a lot easier just to say, okay, here's the income distribution, here are the haves, here are the have-nots, right? What does that mean? But that's probably not the most meaningful example of inequality that we might want to think about, right? And also, by the way, when I say easier to measure, sure, right? But that doesn't mean that inequality data is good, especially in developing countries. How we measure wealth and inequality is really, really bad, right? I've written papers about income inequality in a global sense using global income inequality data. So I feel like I can pick on myself here, but how we measure wealth in a developing country, for example, is just, I mean, just bad compared to how we measured other places. Like they do things like go and make socioeconomic status indices where you go and how do you figure out somebody's wealth is you go and interview them and you count the number of things in their house. Like, do they have a bicycle? Do they have a television? Do they have a microwave? And you try to use that as some sort of global measure, I mean global in the sense of holistic for them, measure of wealth, right? But it's actually bad everywhere, right? Because it's just a hard thing to look at, right? And there's income measures versus consumption measures of inequality. So if someone's showing you data and they talk about inequality as if it's a black and white, easy issue, that the data they've shown is conclusive about measuring inequality, they are absolutely full of it. You should be skeptical. You should run. Okay. But when we think about these movements, right, I want us to focus on this picture for a second, because I think in reality, I want to make the argument that there are actually really two things that we might be thinking about when we're talking about income inequality. Okay, and let's focus in on this picture, right? What do they say? This person says no more corruption, right? Get people out of, no bailouts for big banks and things like that. I love this one. I can't afford a lobbyist. I am the 99%. Right? So let's think about what they're saying here. They're essentially saying that what they don't like about this idea of income inequality is that rich people can afford to buy mechanisms through government that can allow them to get richer, right, at the expense of the poor. Right? I agree with them wholeheartedly on this, right? That it is absolutely ridiculous at the amount of ability to influence politics that wealth has and wealth's role in politics. We'll talk a little bit more about that in my lectures on Sunday when we talk about the special interest effects and things in politics. But I absolutely agree with them on this. And the second thing I think that people really think about when they think about inequality is poverty. And that, if we want to tackle poverty, that's a very different scenario than thinking about the distribution of income more generally. So let's talk about crony capitalism first, and then we're going to talk about poverty. Okay, so I think crony capitalism is alive and well in the United States, and I think folks that are talking about these issues might have a real point here. So I've got two articles to show you guys, one from the Washington Post and one from Bloomberg, so no one can accuse me of being too left or too right of center, I suppose. So here's an article from the supposed fake news media, right, about who's getting these hundreds of billions in dollars in government aid, right? Well, for right now, the public might be in the dark. This was written back in April. And they're doling out a whole lot of coronavirus relief that we're going to be on the hook for forever, right? An average of, I believe, about $6,000 in debt, in national debt, just from the CARES package per person in the United States. Right? So if you think about how much this act cost and how much you might have gotten, so you might have gotten what, an $1,800 or $1,200 rebate on your taxes, right? So you might have gotten a check from the government for $1,200. Woohoo, great, wonderful, right? But now in terms of the amount of debt we've accumulated, we're essentially on the hook per taxpayer of about $6,000, right? So where did the rest of the money go, right? And this is, by the way, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the Treasury Secretary talking about this and about withholding information about what companies receive this. Well, now we finally have information about what companies receive this. This is from Bloomberg, and look at these companies that received this. So a huge amount of the bailout did not go to small mom and top businesses. The Paycheck Protection Program was essentially intended for that. But look, American Airlines got not 5 million, but $5.8 billion, right, from COVID relief funds. Delta, United, all of the big ones, right, were all bailed out in this way, right? Healthcare companies, which you would think would do really well during a pandemic, but actually didn't because everyone stopped going to the doctor, right? But still, right, these companies got millions and millions and millions of dollars from this. Ruth's Hospitality Group, J. Alexander's, these are very fancy restaurant chains. If you guys have ever heard of Ruth's Chris and things like that, these are not mom and pop companies, right? So one might look at this, and when we think about notions of income inequality and say, hey, right, we don't like the idea that it seems to me that big companies, right, wealthy folks, in one way, can pull the levers of government, right, in order to get more money that sort of leave poor folks out, right? And I absolutely agree with them in that sense. right? The true welfare queens in our society aren't poor folks. The true welfare queens in our society are big businesses, maybe agricultural interests. They're a pretty big one. If we think about where all of this money is being spent. Okay. So what else what else might we mean, right, when we're talking about inequality, right? Is it really inequality that we care about most, right? Or is it something else? What about social dimensions of inequality? So would you rather be the poorest person in a rich society, right? If you are the poorest person in a rich society, does this matter in terms of our views of others, right? Or would you rather be a wealthy person in a poor society? I think I'd rather be the poorest person in a rich society personally, in terms of what statistics tell us about life expectancy and happiness and other things. But that's an interesting question, right? And so my question is, are we all like Eric Cartman? And I will tell you a quick story about this, but I won't belabor the point. I was going to show you guys a little clip from South Park, but thanks to the perils of intellectual property, I am not allowed. Sad. Take it up with, I guess, IP attorneys. But anyway, and so in this clip from South Park, basically what happens, if you guys haven't watched as much South Park as me, which shame on you for your cultural education, Eric Cartman goes around and he basically wants to figure out, Kenny's parents go to jail, so he needs to figure out who the poorest kid in school is, because he wants to essentially pick on them, right? With all kinds of your mama is so poor jokes, right? So he does all these things where he works with somebody else to cross-reference things like free school lunches with addresses in the computer, right? And they pull it up and he finds out, he gets all excited, but then he finds out that he's actually the poorest kid in school now, right? And then what does he do? He goes home and he tells his mother, come on, mom, life isn't handed to you. You need to get off your butt and, you know, get out and get another job and all of this kind of stuff, all because he doesn't want to be the poorest kid in school. And it makes him look like kind of a jerk, right? I don't think that we're actually Eric Cartman. Right? I don't think we care about inequality, right, because we don't want to be the poorest kid in school, right, or the poorest kid in a society. I think we might care about inequality because we actually associate high inequality with high levels of poverty. We might care about what living conditions are like for the poorest among us in society. We might care about the ability of the poorest among us to lift themselves up, right, on the economic ladder, and that there aren't impingements to that freedom, okay? And so in a global sense, right, we need to think about inequality, but we need to think about our place in that society too. So right here, this is data. It's a screenshot with some extra data from gapminder.org, but by the way, if you guys haven't explored this, grad students that are teachers, Gapminder is so cool for showing really neat data to your students. So, you know, just shameless plug for that. But here's a line, right, showing the global world income distribution as of 2019. And right here, I've put a line right where 1% is, okay? And so, and by the way, the colors, right, are associated with regions of the world, right? In each little area between the white space are different countries. So just for your record, this one right here is the United States, for those of you that are in the United States. And what we've noticed is that in order to be a member of the 1%, right, you need to have a household income above $110 per day, right? So most folks that we can think about in the US, right, or at least that are on this call, right, might very well, for a household income, approach incomes of about $40,000 per year, right? So the average member of the United States, the average citizen in the United States, has incomes that are well above the vast majority of the rest of the world population, right? So what I'm here to tell you is you might very well be in the global 1%. And why does that matter? I think it might matter because if we can be sort of global egalitarians about this, then if we care about poverty, if we care about inequality because we care about poverty, right, we might want to focus on world incomes much more than incomes within this green band right here. Okay, and there's still some good news to be had here, right? So that hockey stick graph, right, still applies in some ways to world income. So this is the same graph in 1800, right? But now I've put in the level of the World Bank's definition of extreme poverty, which is right about $2 per day purchasing power parity dollars. Okay, and if you notice in 1800, as I said, right, Hobbes might be right here, right? We're all, life is nasty, brutish, and short, right about here, right? Most of the population is living in extreme poverty in the world, right? And the height of all of these, by the way, is the number of people, to give you about how many people we're talking about. Well, now, fast forward to 2019, and we've got some pretty big good news, right? Same poverty line. Right now, only 10.1% of the world's population is living in extreme poverty. And this is a change, by the way, that has occurred in recent years, in the past 20, 30 years, pretty dramatically, right? So now all of a sudden we see that the vast majority of the world, right, even if not making near what rich countries like the US does, right? The vast majority of the world has lifted themselves out of extreme poverty. That's pretty good news, right? But I really think that if we care about inequality because we care about poverty, right, then this is the distribution we need to be thinking about much more than the US distribution. Okay. And the good news is, and this is what I'll tackle in my second lecture, is that we kind of know how to do this, right? If we want to think about why this is going on, right? Why we went from here to here, right? A big part of it has been a result of increases in economic freedom for the vast majority of humanity, okay? And so, right, economic freedom, when I talk about economic freedom, first of all, I want to note that I differ it from political freedom, but we can talk more about that in Q&A if you guys like. But I mean sort of the state of the world that Adam Smith liked to talk about. This is one of the reasons I titled my talk, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, right? And the Wealth of Nations. So he said in 1755, and some notes from one of his lectures, by the way, this is 21 years before The Wealth of Nations was published. So this guy was thinking about this stuff for a long time, right? We get this very famous quote that many of you guys may have seen before, right? Where he talks about little else is required to carry a state, right, to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. So that's one of the theories of economic growth that we're going to talk about in the next lecture.
So we do have several questions, and let's just jump straight into those. First, what explains the wage stagnation relative to inflation of the lower quintile of US workers since the 1970s?
Okay, so I think there's several sort of answers to this. So first of all, there is some debate, right, in the data itself about wage stagnation since the 70s, right? So as I said in my lecture, a lot of inequality data, right, sort of depends on how you measure it. And one way to look at that, right, is wages, right? Folks sometimes like to focus on this because they talk about earned income through wages versus unearned income from things like investments. And because again, it's not about the place in society, right, that we are. It's not about a static interpretation. People care about inequality because of how they've gotten there, right? But in reality, if you look at the data for wages, even since the 70s, if you look at what's gone on with the average American worker, right? And we can have a debate about, do we want to talk about averages or not? But in general, we've seen since the 70s a pretty big increase in real wages in terms of what the average American worker can buy, right? So there's a famous, Don Boudreaux talks about this a lot, for those of you that know him. He used to do this talk where he'd talk about looking at the Sears catalog and looking at what the average American worker could buy in 1970 versus the average American worker could buy today. And generally, in terms of actual purchasing power and things that we might think about that might contribute to standard living or utility or happiness in some way, the average American worker is way better off and way wealthier, at least in a material sense, but materials can matter, right, than they were in 1970. So I think that's a thing that's pretty important to keep in mind. But I do think that question gets at a lot of what people are talking about, which I think is important when they talk about income inequality, which is, why do we care about that? And I think that question was a good one because it speaks to that.
What do you think about the data on inequality that Thomas Piketty cites in his book Capital? What do you think is the cause of that sort of inequality? And what do you think of his proposal to raise the top income bracket taxes back to 1950s levels?
So I think it's kind of misguided. First of all, there's a lot of evidence. This is a great example again, and I don't mean to beat this point to death, but it's a great example of how the inequality data is really messed up and can differ a lot by what objectives you want to use it for. And a lot of folks have looked at the Piketty data. Phil Magnus is one of them, some other folks, and I can give you guys some other references, and have really torn apart the Piketty data on its face, right? So saying essentially, he might not be able to make the arguments that he says he can with the data, right? But then in terms of focusing on wealth and versus consumption and other things, I think there's a lot of big incentive problems that might happen with fulfilling Piketty's policy proposals. So we need to worry about things like how taxes on wealth might affect marginal incentives and marginal incomes to earn, and how that might affect incentives to invest more generally. And to the extent that it affects those investment decisions, we might see really big, I don't want to use the word trickle down because I don't like that word, but we might see really big impacts on folks that we don't intend to affect those, right? So increased investment by wealthy folks does help the average American worker and the poor American worker, and we might want to make sure we don't have unintended consequences.
Do you think libertarians spend too much time attempting to justify the current distribution of wealth? And should we actually spend more time talking about the economic barriers and rent seeking that makes the current distribution unjust?
Yes. I probably should elaborate. But essentially, that's kind of, whoever asked that question, yeah, you and I agree, right? And I think it's partially because, right, markets are often attacked because of using these wealth inequality numbers, right? They say things like, oh, inequality is so bad in the US compared to parts of Europe, and why can't we be more like Sweden or something like that? And so we try to attack those arguments on its face, but I think we actually need to step back and say, okay, why do we care about this inequality data, right? What do we mean by that? So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree.
What are some ways in which economic inequality might translate into social or political inequalities that we are concerned about?
Well, I think that one way economic inequality can translate into political inequalities has a whole lot to do with sort of the crony capitalism argument that I talked about in my lecture. So to the extent that, and we'll talk about rent seeking too on Sunday, but to the extent that it is possible to the extent that the economic pie, right, the more of the economic pie is allocated by government, right, the bigger the incentives to rent seek, the more that political power and economic power are interlinked. And that can create real problems in terms of how we think about inequality from feeding crony capitalism, right? So if The economic pie, right, is more distributed by government than markets. First of all, we got an efficiency problem, right? Like there's lots and lots and lots of studies that show that economies with higher degrees of rent seeking don't do as well overall for everybody than economies with lower amounts of rent. But besides the economic pie getting smaller, we also have a much bigger problem in terms of political inequalities too that can come from economic inequalities. And we see this also in disasters in other areas, right? So other things, like for example, when we input like things like price gouging laws and things like that, and we prevent markets from working, right? What we see is it's not the poor that end up with the goods in cases of shortages and stuff. It's the politically connected, right? And those folks, the politically connected folks, aren't poor. So I think there's really big links between economic inequalities and political inequalities, and that link has a lot to do with rent seeking.
Are Latin American countries like Chile examples of crony capitalism?
I think, I'm not an expert on Chile, I'm just gonna, throw that out there. But I actually think Chile in some cases has been kind of an economic success story, right? And I wanna separate, that's a great example of differences between economic freedom and political freedom, right? So I'm not necessarily saying, right, that Pinochet was a great human being, right? I'm saying maybe the opposite of that. But I think we need to recognize that in places like Chile, we have seen decreases in poverty, right, that are important to talk about. And contrasting Chile with, say, a country like Venezuela, right, or other places, that matters a lot, right? Now, there are still political issues in Chile that I'm sure we can talk about, but if I had to pick a place in, like, if we're gonna sort of almost go like a Heller's version of a veil of ignorance, okay? So philosophers are gonna like cringe at me, but right, if I had to go behind a veil of ignorance and pick and not know what person in society I was gonna be in Chile versus in Venezuela, right? And I had to pick a country to live in, oh, I'd pick Chile hands down. Right? So I think it's important to think about political freedom, certainly, but we do want to necessarily disconnect it from it.
What are some ways that measures designed to reduce inequality have made society more unjust?
Okay, one example we could think about are things like that you might think, right? It sounds really politically salient, right? So examples like price gouging laws are a classic example of one, right? So we talk about, or in general, price controls, right, on goods with the hopes that the poor will be able to have more of those things, right? Those laws tend to result in shortages of the good under question, and as a result, fewer people total end up with the good than you'd otherwise expect. We see this you might not care about bottled water in an emergency or toilet paper during COVID, like maybe those things aren't particularly salient to you, but we also see this in things like prescription drugs, right? So we see price controls on everything from insulin to chemotherapy drugs, right? Let's think about goods we might not want to shortage of. Insulin for type 1 diabetics, yeah, pretty sure they'll die if they don't have that, and chemotherapy drugs, right? And so as a result, we see that less of these goods are produced than otherwise would be. And as a result, we see, I would consider that to be sort of an unjust state of affairs. But lots of programs that are intended maybe initially to help the poor end up hurting them. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was passed during the great alphabet soup of the New Deal, right? So this was intended to help poor farmers during the Great Depression. What happened as a result? Lots of poor farmers didn't have things like the literacy skills and political connections, right, to apply for a lot of those subsidies. Where do we see agricultural subsidies go now? Huge agribusinesses, right, that have no business receiving them. And who does that also hurt? In many cases, the poorest of the poor in developing countries. right? So really poor folks, right? So I think there's tons of examples. Basically, if you give me an example of a government program that's intended to help the poor, I bet you I can show you how it didn't.
What are some examples of policies that do help absolute poverty?
Okay, I'm going to get to this a little bit in my next lecture, so I want to save some of it, but I'll give you guys a little bit of preview. And some of these are politically tenable, some of them are not, right? For example, if we really cared about global poverty, like for reals, we didn't just pay it lip service by doing things like visiting Belize and taking pictures with our friends as we built a well or something. If we really cared about global poverty, we'd open the borders, right? Or at least relax them severely. So that's a huge policy that I think would help global inequality a bunch, but may not happen. Certainly not in this political climate. Other policies that we could think of would be policies to encourage entrepreneurship, decreasing barriers to entrepreneurship with things like occupational licensing laws and silly things like that. I think there's a lot of things we could do to help decrease inequality. And a lot of them have, the good news is, I think, for folks that attend an IHS seminar, a lot of them have to do with liberalism.
Why is it that things like healthcare, housing, and education continue to be very expensive and are increasingly so, while prices in other sectors decline?
Oh, this is a great, this is a question that we need about 3 courses to talk about. So I'm currently teaching a health economics course, for example, and the entire course is all about increases in health expenditures and why that's the case, okay? But I think a huge reason that healthcare and education, health and education are both sectors of the economy that in weird ways are very similar. Neither are anything close to resembling free markets or capitalism, right? If you want to get, like, in private conversation, if you want to watch my head explode, just talk about how the US system is a free market system for healthcare, and I have my head. But anyway, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, actually this relates to the previous question, well-intended policies that are intended to sort of to increase justice in whatever one way we might think about, that actually have the opposite effect. So health insurance is a great example. So why do we generally feel differently about health insurance than we do for other goods? We feel differently about health than we do about any other good in the world, right? People talk about access to healthcare all the time. They never talk about access to a cheeseburger, right? Or something else, right? We feel very differently in our hearts about health. So why do we talk about making sure everybody's insured, right? And it's, again, I think part of this idea of some concept of fairness in one way or another. But the reality is that health insurance, in large part, contributes to huge increases in healthcare prices, largely because people don't face a price for their healthcare. So as a result, their demand is much less elastic. Much less elastic than we would want, especially for goods like that they wouldn't buy without health insurance. Things like dermatological care, we might treat very differently than the demand for insulin, right? But anyway, so as a result, right, by decreasing that price sensitivity and subsidizing these goods pretty heavily, right, we see this dramatic increase in price that in effect means we have to have health insurance in order to buy the good in the first place. So it creates this vicious cycle. Add into the fact that we have all kinds of things like really strict occupational licensing for folks like doctors, right? This has been going on. I mean, Milton Friedman uses this as an example, right? When he talks about physician licensure. This has been going on forever, but as a result, it's a lot harder to get in the healthcare business than it is in lots of other businesses. So many things contribute to, the rise in healthcare expenditures over time. Same for education. I want to be I've gone off on this question, so I want to keep it short, but we could do the same story with education in this country. right? We subsidize it, we take away individual choice, and then we wonder why college got so expensive, right? It's the same sort of scenario we could talk about with healthcare, but in other ways.
Why is there so much disagreement over the empirical data on inequality? Why do equally rational and intelligent economists disagree over the facts?
One is that, okay, so one reason is just the data is really tough to come by, right? So even in the US, where we have all kinds of data, we have survey data, we have income tax data, we have all kinds of data in some ways, we still don't have great data that sort of, let's say, follows people over time and gets what we maybe want to get at to measure these things well, right? And that's in the US, right? In developing countries, we can have really bad data. There's sometimes political reasons that some of this data gets mixed up. There's a phrase that when I used to do work with data with China, there's the phrase that there's lies and damn lies, and there's statistics and Chinese statistics. So some of that data can get manipulated for political reasons. But then even if we all had perfect data, I think we can all use that data to tell the story that we want to tell, right? So Piketty uses data to tell a story that he wants to tell, right? Phil Magnus uses that data, right, and goes against it to talk about that too, but he's telling the story too, right? And also inequality is this great political tool, right, to talk about in politics. So also in the news, and politicians on the left and the right have lots of incentive to use that data to stir up, right, support for them versus somebody else, right? So Hillary Clinton can talk about wealth inequality and can talk about things like the gender wage gap, right, and create problems with inequality even among genders, right? But at the same time, Donald Trump can talk about inequality from immigrants coming in and taking our jobs and these kinds of things, right? So in many ways, this notion of fairness drives politics, and I think that's a big part of the problem as well.
If we assume that minimum wages are here to stay, how should we think about them?
That's an interesting question. Well, one thing we can think about right now is in many areas of the world, of the US, I'm sorry, right now, the minimum wage isn't really binding in most sectors. So what I mean by that is, for example, I don't make the minimum wage, right? It doesn't affect me because the price that I would buy and sell my labor for, right, is above the price that would be caught by a minimum. I want to draw a graph right now and I can't. That would be caught in the market. So in some ways, if the minimum wage isn't binding, we don't have as much to worry about. Now, that being said, do I think proposals from folks like Sanders and other folks about a $15 minimum wage, do I find that problematic? Absolutely. Do I think that would hurt the poor more than it would help the poor? Absolutely. I think what we need to do as folks that might like liberalism, right, is we need to have conversations with our friends on the left, right? We need to, like the modern liberals, right? We need to talk to them about that we have similar, I mean, I want to help the poor. I'm a pretty big fan. I became an international health and development economist for a reason, right? But we need to talk about the idea that some of these policies might not have the consequences we want and why, right? We need to come up with the best arguments that we can, but also come from this place of compassion, right? That we can. So that's one of the reasons I think seminars like this one with the idea of modern challenges to liberty are so cool, right? It's addressing these ideas and thinking about how can we affect change through conversations, which we really don't have, I think, enough in this country anymore. So, but yeah, that's one of the things I think I would do. And also, there's tons of occupational regulation we can talk about that would also, I think, be a good fodder. And I think both parties could potentially get behind that too.
We've got time for one more question. It seems like everyone from the most robust libertarians to the most ardent egalitarians can agree that rent seeking is a serious problem. Why is it so hard to mobilize behind this and decrease the amount of rent seeking? Why is this such a seemingly lofty goal?
Oh, special interests. So some of it we'll talk about on Sunday as well. But basically, it's the idea that we as a whole are rationally ignorant as a populace, right? So as a result, it creates lots of incentives for folks that are affected a lot by legislation to lobby for it. But the rest of us are rationally uninformed about it. So a big reason that it makes rent seeking so hard to get rid of has to do with just the basis kind of our democracy itself, right? And that what, and we see it more with, I think, the rise of populism and other things that we've seen around the world in recent years. So my solution to this, if we think democracy and democratic decision-making might be the best relative to alternatives, and we can have that debate, one thing we can do to take care of rent seeking is just decrease the amount of rents that there are to be distributed in the first place. I don't think we can prevent, unless we want to entirely change the sort of form of government we have in our country, which we can talk about, anarchists, whatever. But I think one way we want to do that is decrease the amount of damage it can do by decreasing the amount of rents that can be distributed in the first place.